evening, everybody. Welcome to this very special Father's Day edition of Sunday Night Live. Excuse me just 1 minute. Need to get myself comfortable in my chair. And here we are, 18th of June already. And we're rapidly propelling ourselves inexorably towards the middle of summer. And then in towards winter, and the nights getting longer and the days getting shorter. Just to cheer you all up, I thought I'd say that. So, but yes, welcome everybody. Happy Father's Day to all of you fathers out there. And even if you don't have kids, you can still be a father. You can be a father figure to somebody. And that's just as valid as being a biological parent. And if you're a stepfather, all the more power to you, because that's just as crucial a role as it is to be father to your own offspring. So, in fact, I would argue even more so. I have a wonderful stepfather, and he is an amazing father, even though his kids are not his own. And he has done an outstanding job over the years, and I'm immensely proud of him. So, whether you have your own kids, or whether you are a stepfather to kids, or whether you are a father figure to younger people, you are all awesome. And I celebrate each and every one of you. Now we have that said, welcome everybody. And Billy Morgan was like, how early was Billy? Billy was like an hour ahead of time. An hour and 5 minutes ahead of time. And then Ron Figuro came in next. And then Alps Media LLC. Louis, my awesome sponsor, is here as well. Christopher Manrachner is here. I still don't get your last name right, but one day it will be flawless, I promise. But he is here. He says, I'm going to start showing up on Friday. Only way to beat you two here. Yeah. I think maybe, like, as soon as this show's finished, I'll actually set it up for next week's show, and you can be the first one in the door, and you'll be a whole week ahead of schedule, and nobody can beat that. All right, John Hawk is here. Kevin's Guitar Stories is here as well, and Papa Raptor Music is here, and Just Bob is here too. He says, "Happy Father's Day to all the great dads out there. No need to congrats me, no kiddos." Yes, you're a father to all of us, Bob. Absolutely. So you are just as valued as everybody else here. And of course, Bill Shepherd is here as well. Long time no see, Bill. Welcome. Glad you're here, my friend. And we've got Keith from Radio Tuck Trumpet, who is here too. And Don Oliver is here. And Paul Morgan is here. Not to be confused with Paul Morgan is here. He says, Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. And we've got Rich from Studio One Tuts here as well, who says salut. And we got Sean Aaron here as well. And I think that is so far it who has said hello in the chat. So welcome everybody. We got 19, nearly 20 people here, which is fantastic. It'd be lovely if we could have 20 likes as well. Please, it helps me out a lot if you like what I do. If you think what I do is valuable at all to you in any way, shape or form, please do hit the like button. If you're not a subscriber yet and you would you'd like to be involved in the chat, you need to be a subscriber first. So hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, select all notifications. That way you don't miss anything, and there's a ton of stuff coming, by the way. I know I keep saying that every week. There's a ton of stuff coming, but there really is. I am just waiting for the exact right moment to drop this cool stuff that I've got coming. So be on the lookout for that, because there's not just Studio One stuff coming. There's Notion stuff, videos that I'm going to be making. So new Studio One videos that I'm working on right now, and new Notion mobile videos that I'm working on right now too. So yeah, those are going to be coming very soon. So keep your eyes out on those. Be subscribed. Be notified. That way you don't miss any of the stuff that's coming, including shows like this that I do on Sunday, and my Wednesday Songwriting Simplified show as well. All right, so just a little bit of news. The first week of July is going to be a wee bit weird because I'm on vacation for that week. And so Wednesday's Songwriting Simplified for that first week of July will not be going ahead. There will be no show on the Wednesday night. So that's just for the first week of July. We're not there yet, but just to give you guys the heads up, 2 weeks from Wednesday, so that's going to be July the 5th, there will be no show. Because I will be out of town and out of this studio. So won't be able to do the show. All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to start tonight with a detailed question that was sent to us by our very own Chris Rackner, who is a fantastic dude. If you don't know him, I certainly recommend you get to know this guy, because he's a great guy. So he says, this might not be a topic for Sunday. But by the way, he sent this as an email. So if you go down the bottom there to jonnylipshamstudios.co.uk, type that into your browser, and that'll take you to my website. Hit the Contact Us button, and a form will appear. That's how you send an email to me. If you've got a question, like Chris had, where there's more detail to the question that you can fit into 200 characters, minus the characters from my name, because you get less now that I ask you to do that, then send an email to me and I will start the show with your question first. So this is Chris's question. He says, this may not be a topic for the Sunday show, but would you be able to demonstrate how to bring certain instruments or vocals to the front of a mix? All of my mixes sound like they're being played at some large stadium, even though I have not applied any reverb or delay. That's an interesting point that he makes right there. Which I will address shortly. He says, I know I've asked this before, but placing instruments in the field of view sound in front of me is proving to be a measurably difficult task. Interesting choice of words. I would like to hear an appropriately arranged orchestra with soloist on violin or cello sitting at the front stage. Somehow I'll never get this correct. Some examples would be absolutely wonderful. By the way, I find you and your shows very interesting and educational. You are very welcome, Chris, and I'm glad that these shows are of value to you, and it's also a good thing that you are also involved in the after-show Zooms as well, where we get to talk about these kind of things in a wee bit more detail. Now, I don't have an orchestral arrangement that I can present before you, unfortunately, but what I'm going to show you, you can apply the principles to any genre of music, because the principles of this are very similar to any style of music. So this is going to be totally applicable. You will just have to tailor it very slightly, but fundamentally the principle, he says, hitting the microphone, the principle is going to work for you. Okay? So we will start with this, and I'm going to use one of my songs from my that I put out not that long ago. It's called Dig Myself a Hole, and it's a blues tune essentially, but it does feature a horn section and a rhythm section, all of which could certainly crowd out the vocals if you're not careful. So the first thing I'm gonna say to you here is a principle, and I don't need to open Studio One to teach you this principle. And the principle here is, and I was taught this years ago, like early 90s, early 1990s, when I was just like, 16, 17 years old, and just beginning to get interested in music production. Having already been on a few records as a session musician, I wanted to learn more about the whole process. So I talked a lot to audio engineers that were involved in production and involved in mixing when I was working on records as a session musician, and I was waiting to do various parts that I needed to do. So there was a lot of sitting around. So I talked to the engineers, and the guy that taught me this he was actually quite young, but he'd been involved in music production a lot. He had some high profile credentials to his name, and he would only be about 7 or 8 years older than me. So he would have been in his early 20s. And so anyway, he said to me, the important thing is what you mix last, you will mix loudest. And he said that was the secret to making sure that the vocals stayed up front. There's like a few other things that you add to it, but fundamentally, if you mix the most important elements of your mix last, then you will mix them loudest, because you will need them to be louder than the other elements of the mix in order to be loud enough to project above the other elements of your mix. So with rock or pop or jazz music, this is really important, especially if you've got lots of other instrumentation going on. So if you're working with a vocalist in an orchestra or a soloist in an orchestra, you can still apply this. Even if you're working with a vocalist in a big band, you can still apply this as much to a rock album. And so with this in mind, when you're mixing, mix your rhythm section. Then after you've done that, start with all of the other accompanying elements. And from least importance first on up to most important. Okay? So start with the rhythm section, get that sounding freaking awesome. And then all of your other accompanying elements. Start with the least important element. Get that sitting in the mix as it is. And then start adding the other elements in order of importance up to the most important element. And then you should have all of your arrangement except for the vocal or except for the lead instruments, whatever those are. And get all of those sitting just right in the mix and sounding really, really good. And then the last thing you deal with is the lead vocal or the lead instrument or lead instruments. So if you've got like, let's say a violin duet with a chamber orchestra, get the orchestra sitting together nicely first. And then bring in your two solo violins. And those two solo violins will need to be louder than the rest of the orchestral elements in order to kind of have that upfront kind of sound before you even add any plugins. And then the next task, once you've done that, and this is all just with faders, by the way. This is all with faders. And I'm not talking about EQs and compressors or limiters yet. Just do this with faders. Just balance all this stuff out with faders. So when you're thinking about orchestra, or then, maybe have the conductor's perspective in mind. So for panning, that is. So pan the elements of your orchestra from the conductor's perspective. And then what you do is you place your lead instruments in the conductor's perspective. So right in the front, right in the center. Okay? So if you've got two violins and they're kind of playing off of each other, pan them very, very slightly left and right. So they're still kind of up front and they're still kind of in the center, but one is slightly left, one is slightly right. Okay? And then when one of them has a bit more of a lead role, you can do some panning automation to bring that up to the center, and then you can pan it back out to where it was before. And the same with the other violin. So that's assuming a violin duet with a small chamber orchestra. If it's a much bigger orchestra, you just multiply that out. And you decide where different elements of the orchestra go, either to the left or to the right or to the center. Now, if you want elements to sit further back in the mix, there's a little trick you can do with that, and you can do that with reverb. Here's the thing about reverb. Reverb not only sweetens, it also pushes things further back in the mix. So if you want things to sit further back in the mix, apply some reverb to those elements. You want things to sit forward, make them dry. Make them dry. And then those things that are dry will have the impression of being much more up front, and those things with reverb will feel like, to your ears, they will feel like they are further back. So that will get your front to back depth perception of your mix. Okay? And then your stereo perspective is all about placing elements either left or right. And then, just kind of having a good spread of all of your elements. So things like strings. Strings are great because strings are kind of enveloping. If you look at kind of the horseshoe shape of the orchestra, you've got strings left, center, and right. So you can do that. You can have the strings kind of spread right across the stereo spectrum. And then you can have your woodwinds on the left and your brass on the right, low woodwinds on the left, low brass on the right, or kind of maybe center right, and so on and so forth. And then percussion, you can you can have them center. For the most part, I would put percussion in the center, unless like timpani, for example. Timpani, orchestral bass drum, snare drum, center. Cymbals, center. And then you can put vibraphones and xylophones and marimbas wherever you want them. Triangles, I would put that in the center as well. But everything else you can kind of put off one side or the other. But what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to show you kind of how I approach the mix to dig myself a hole. So let me just open that song up for you. And we'll go over to it. All right, so this is the song, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the lead vocals and the backing vocals as well. Actually, let's take them out as well. And I will play from the beginning of the first verse. Now, obviously, this is a finished mix, but what I did when I started doing this mix was I started over here on the main output channel. And I started with a little bit of fat channel, a little bit of Brit comp compression, because this is essentially an SSL style compressor. And so we've got a 30 millisecond attack, 100 millisecond release, 2-to-1 ratio, and basically I just dialed up the threshold until I see just a smidge of compression, hardly touching it. You'll barely see this needle move, but it does move a little bit, and it moves enough, in my opinion. And so that's what this is. And basically all this does is just bind everything together. Now, if you're doing orchestral music, yeah, you may not want to do this. But you can, but you may find that it's just not applicable, because the dynamic range of orchestral music is going to be much larger. It's going to be pianissimo all the way to forte fortissimo. It's going to be really quite large. So finding compression settings that are going to suit that without kind of crushing the mix when it gets really loud is going to be a challenge. So I would maybe don't do this for orchestral music. But in this context, it worked pretty well. And then I have added a bit of, this is what I did at the very end of the mix. Once I had completely finished, I just added just a little bit of width. And basically all this binaural pan does is it turns up the sides just a little bit. It's a little bit of mid-side processing under the hood with this guy. All it does is just open up the gain on the sides a little bit. Gives the impression of the mix being a little bit wider than it is. And then a little bit of EQ, scooping out anything below 20 hertz, because you don't need anything below 20 hertz. And then scooping out a little bit of 390, roughly, with a very broad Q. So it's basically grabbing anything kind of 50, 60 hertz or 100 hertz either side of it. And then opening up the top just a tiny little smidge. And then limiter and phase meter, these things are kind of added at the end. They're not really necessary. They're just there just to make everything up to that commercial loudness that everybody wants. All right. And then the next phase is bus mixing. I mix everything in the buses. So I set everything up. Everything is routed to these buses. And then once I've done that, I don't touch the buses just yet. The first thing I do is set everything up, and then I leave them, and I go all the way over here, and I turn all of these faders down to 0, or down to the bottom, I should say. And then I start bringing in the rhythm section. So I start with the drums, and then I bring in the bass, and then I bring in keyboards, and then I bring in guitars, and I leave the solo guitar to last because that is a featured instrument, just like the lead vocal is a featured instrument. So what you mix last, you mix loudest. So those two elements get done last of all. So rhythm section, and I'm just looking to get a good balance without any plugins whatsoever. And I'm just balancing the faders, and I'm panning things about left and right. And then once I've done that, I move on to the horn section. Again, no plugins, balance the faders, pan left and right, and basically I zero in on a section that has a lot of horn section activity. So it's going to be kind of this section here. And then maybe this bit here. If I just back this up a bit. Let's mute the solo guitar. We don't need that just yet. So let's go back again. All right, so once I've got the balance of the rhythm section and the horn section, then the next thing to do is backing vocals. So we can unmute those, and we can go into, which one should we go into? Let's actually go into chorus 2. So basically what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for these guys to basically sit just a tiny bit behind the horns, but not too much because I don't want them to get lost by the horns particularly. And once I've got them all balanced, then the next thing I do, once I've got all of these sections individually balanced, then I go back over here and I turn down all of these bus channels. Basically, to start with, I have these bus channels set to 0. And then I turn them all down, and I do the same kind of thing again. But this time I'm balancing sections together. So I'm not just balancing individual faders, I'm balancing individual sections against each other. And this is kind of what I end up with. And normally I would have some parallel drums and some parallel bass, and you know, a few other things would have some parallel compression as well. But not on this particular mix. I decided that with this particular mix, I did not want to do any parallel compression particularly. So once I've done that, then and then only do I get to adding plugins. So you'll notice here, I've got some EQ and some compression, and I've got actually a couple of compressors stacked here. This is another thing I like to do. But that's for another subject. And then I'm using Fat Channel in some cases where I'm just only using the compressor element. I'm not using the EQ element. And then there are some where I'm using EQ and compression in the Fat Channel. And I've also got a de-esser on here as well. And this is the PreSonus de-esser added to Studio One 6. But you'll also notice here that I have delay on the lead vocals, and I have reverb on the backing vocals, and I have reverb on the horn section. So this goes back to what I talked about earlier about using reverb to push things back and using drier elements to have things sit more up front. So I have a very subtle delay here with a very, very slight ping pong to it for the vocal. And the idea with this is what it's going to do is, and I've got, do I have some sidechain? No, I don't think I do have some sidechain here. But what this does is the delay gives the lead vocal a little bit of width, but only a little bit. And it gives itself some atmosphere around it. And then I'm using the reverb, quite a lot of reverb on the backing vocals and a different reverb. I'm using a whole reverb, a large whole reverb, a plate I think it is, for the horns. And the reason being is I'm using the reverbs to push these elements further back in the mix to help the lead vocal sit up front. So the secret here is with the reverbs and the delays to get things to sit back or sit up front. That's one secret to getting elements up front and other elements further back in your mix. But there's a second secret. The second secret is compression. So to get things to be more up front, you need more transient coming through the compressor. So you need a slower attack. So set your compressor to have a slower attack and a faster release in order for the elements you want to be up front to be up front. And then for elements that you want to be further back, set your compressor to have a faster attack and a slower release. And the faster attack will grab the transient earlier, and that will give the impression of it being a little bit further back in the mix as well. All right, so fast attack and reverbs pushes back, slow attack and delays or no ambient effects at all brings things forward. The other secret, so those are two secrets to getting things up front. The third secret is parallel compression. And this is where you create a secondary bus channel, or you can do this now with the splitter. It's actually very easy with the splitter. But you can do this with a secondary bus channel, and you send a pre-fader send of your vocal or the element that you want to be up front in your mix to that bus, and you put a compressor on that bus and you slam the crap out of it. You basically hit it as hard and as fast as possible. So fast attack, fast release, get that thing hit hard with a lot of compression. So dial up that ratio, dial back that threshold, get that needle absolutely hammering. And then what you do is you turn it down and you blend it in with your unheavily compressed signal. This is why we call it parallel, because it's a copy that you're taking a copy of your signal, you're slamming it to death, and then you're blending it in. And what that does is that gives a slight thickening effect, and that helps that element to come up front even more. So this is why in rock records you hear the vocal appear to be really, really up front, as well as being really, really loud. That's the beauty of parallel compression. Parallel compression is used a lot in rock music, not so much in orchestral music. So if you're working in orchestral music, parallel compression is not going to work for you. However, compression still is going to work for you, but you're going to use it much more subtly. You will be using compression not to compress or control dynamic range necessarily. You'll be using compression rather to get things to sit further back or sit things further up front. So when you compress, even if you're only compressing by 3 dB, with a slow attack, you then use the makeup gain to make up those 3 dB that you've lost with the compression. And that turns, so basically your compressor is going to do that to your audio signal, and then the makeup gain is going to do that. And it's going to turn the whole signal up by 3 dB. And by doing that, that moves the whole element further up front. So you're giving yourself a little bit of control over the dynamic range of that instrument. Plus, you're also turning it up just a wee bit as well overall, and that makes that element sit up front a wee bit more. So in orchestral music, you're not really using a whole lot of compression. And certainly, as Tony says here, he's talking about classical guitar. And he says, I don't think you use any compression on solo guitar, on solo classical guitar. It depends on how big is that dynamic range. And I've got people pinging me here. Okay. So with something like solo classical guitar, if the classical work has a large dynamic range, then you may want to contain that dynamic range just a bit so that it's controlled. It's not going to clip. It's not going to be so quiet that you can barely hear it. You want it controlled just a bit. So maybe a little bit of compression, but you wouldn't use something that's really, really fast. So you wouldn't use something like an LA2A. You'd use something like an optical compressor or a tube compressor maybe. So something like an LA2A or some other optical compressor would do the job, because those are going to have a slow attack and it's going to be nice, smooth compression. So it's not going to be so obvious, whereas something like an LA2A is so incredibly fast in how it grabs that it grabs a lot of the transient. So something like an 1176 is great for vocals and for kick drums and for snare drums and for things like that in rock music, where you really want that, that dynamic range really pummeled a wee bit. Whereas in orchestral music, you don't want that. You just want to contain it. That's all you want to do, is contain it a little bit. And then you're using the compression, the attack and the release of the compressor to use that to kind of push things back or bring things forward. And again, the same with kind of reverbs and delays and things like that. But in an orchestral recording, you want everything to sound like it's in the same room, or in the same auditorium. And so even if you're recording everything very dry in a very dry studio, you want everything to sound like it's in this beautiful ambient space. And so everything should have the same reverb, but not necessarily the same amount of reverb. Again, you're using amounts of reverb that you send to the reverb plugin to be that kind of control between what is up front and what's further back. The more drenched in reverb something is, the further it's going to sit back. And the less reverb something has, the more up front it's going to be, by contrast with the elements that are more drenched in reverb. So you can apply that to most different styles of music and most different mixing scenarios, I think. So Chris, I hope that has helped you. Tony says, I see your faders for guitars are not set to 0. Let's go over to the guitars. No, they're not. I'm not sure why I would have my guitars set to 0. Because I don't want them set to 0, because I don't want them louder than everything else. I want them set back a wee bit. The only one that's really set at 0 dB here is the solo guitar. And that's because my solo guitar is a star element. So it's going to be nice and loud. Now, individually on its own, it's negative 2.1. But other than that, it's otherwise the loudest element there, apart from the lead and backing vocals. And it's at minus 2.1 because the horns are not really doing very much during the guitar solo. Let's play the guitar solo. Okay, so solo guitar and lead vocal were the last things that I touched in terms of mixing. For the large portion of the mix, those two guys were muted until I got everything sounding right. And once I got everything sounding right, it was like a breath of fresh air to my ears to have the solo guitar and the lead vocal in the mix. Let's see, what else do we have in terms of commentary here? Kyle says to Tony, he says, I generally add a bit of low-end compression on acoustic guitars, reverb to make it fit the room, but not always necessary. Yeah, just a wee smidge of compression. Ronald says, anyone else getting crackling in my audio? It might be rain that you're hearing, by the way. It might be rain that you're hearing, because it is absolutely hosing it down outside. So that's maybe what you're hearing. Super Squirrel says, I think you've a curriculum laid out, so you probably haven't time to answer this, but I still don't understand why track and channels are separate. This is a good question. So, the reason why track and channels are separate is because tracks and channels do different things. Now, different DAWs do this differently. So, this is not going to be a one answer fits all. Okay, this is going to be an answer specific to Studio One, because the Studio One track and channel dichotomy is maybe a little bit different than how other DAWs do it. But here's how it works. There is a signal flow, if you like, in Studio One. And so tracks are the containers for the audio events or the MIDI events. But in Studio One, MIDI events, MIDI tracks have no audio. They are just no on, no off, and expression data and all of that. It's just data for MIDI in tracks, okay? Audio tracks, these are just waveforms. But these do actually produce audio, all right? But when we go back over to the mixer, this is where you have a difference. So channels, basically the audio goes from the track to the channel. It's like the channel is the mixing console, the analog mixing console, and the track is the tape machine. So you record your sound in the studio standing in front of your mic, and it goes to the tape machine, and from the tape machine into the mixer, and then back out into the stereo 2 track. It's kind of how it works in Studio One. That's exactly how it was modeled to work, actually, which is why there is a difference between tracks and channels. So in the mixer, you have channels, and in the arranger view, you have your tracks and your audio events or your MIDI events. Okay? So tracks here, channels here. Tracks here, channels here. Where this is particularly observable, and I don't have it in this song, but in if you have MIDI, so virtual instruments, if you mute a virtual instrument in the arranger view, you may not see the respective channel in the mixer muted, and vice versa. If you mute it here, you may not see it muted in the arranger view. And this is because tracks and channels are different, especially for instruments. Because with instruments, they are just containers. They don't actually produce any sound. It is just note data and expression data. It's just data, there's no sound. They only have sound when they hit the console. Then they have sound, and they will come into the insert chain and through the sends and the volume fader and the panning controls. Okay, and then out through the routing to the main output. And that's how it works. That's why tracks and channels are different. Tracks don't do what channels do, and channels don't do what tracks do. So I hope that answers that question. Let's see, what else do we have? Kyle says, think of tracks like physical tracks on a piece of tape, and the tracks are what feed the channels. Exactly right. That is exactly how it works in Studio One. Other DAWs do it differently. But this is how it's done in Studio One. There are some DAWs that do this too. Cubase does this to some degree as well. But things like Pro Tools and Logic, they may have a completely different track channel relationship and workflow. But certainly this is how Studio One does it. It's much more like an analog studio in the digital domain. That's how it was designed to work. It was designed that way for a very simple reason. And the reason why is because Studio One was designed to integrate with PreSonus hardware products. That's its reason for existence. Okay, it was a DAW tailored to PreSonus hardware products. So that's the idea, and that's why there had to be this track channel dichotomy. Okay, was basically to support the integration with PreSonus hardware products, which has got deeper and deeper and deeper to the point now where we have this wonderful, glorious, seamless integration between all elements of the PreSonus ecosystem, including Studio One. And Notion, of course, because you can write your score and you can send it to Studio One, and then you can use all of your external PreSonus hardware products to integrate with it and interact with that as well. So it's pretty cool. Tony says, I think when I learned about gain staging, all faders were supposed to be set to 0, but rules were made to be broken. Yeah, here's the thing. I don't do gain staging. Or at least I don't do gain staging the way that other people recommend you do it. And the reason why is because in the digital domain, gain staging is not really necessary. The reason why gain staging exists at all is because of analog tape and analog consoles. Gain staging exists because you needed to exceed the noise floor so that the noise floor didn't take up all of the bandwidth of your mix and dominate everything, and so that everything sounded, you know, like it was being played in a hailstorm. So, you know, because there was quite a loud noise floor in the analog days, and adding different hardware elements into that would add noise. So the more stuff you've got plugged in, and this is where the concept of plugins comes from, but the more stuff you've got plugged in, patched into the console to do different effects on different elements of what is coming into the console, the more noise would be added. And of course, consoles added noise anyway. Tape machines added noise anyway. So there was a noise floor that needed to be exceeded. That's why gain staging exists. In the digital domain, there is virtually no noise floor. It is there, but it is so quiet, it's not a thing. Because it's less than negative 144 dB. It's that quiet. It's not a thing. So gain staging in that respect is just not necessary. So I don't do it like that. Here's what I do. And I've actually shown this in a video made when the input controls were added to Studio One 4. Because actually adding these guys basically gave me the workflow I have always wanted for Studio One. And in fact, the workflow I have wanted since being in any DAW, including Cubase. And I used Cubase for 30 years. And Cubase never gave me what we now have since Studio One 4 in 2018 is these gain controls. Now that we have these, what everybody calls gain staging and what I do can now be done. And that is this. I turn all the faders down to the bottom. I turn them all the way down, and then here's my little secret. I right click and I choose pre-fader metering. All right. And once I've chosen this option, let's choose this actually, and let's go pre-fader metering. So now all the metering is pre-fader. So I can turn all of these faders right down, and I need another example song because I don't want to actually mess up this mix. I mean, it's finished, but I don't want to screw it up. So let's go find another song. Let's open this one up. So I don't actually mind screwing this one up. Let's put that one back in. Let's turn that off. All right, so this is a demo track that I made for the vocoder when that came into Studio One.
This vocoder, it's really very cool. It is the best thing PreSonus has ever done. It really floats my boat. I really, really love it.
And totally crap lyrics that I just totally improvised when I made this track. But anyway, so what we're gonna do is I think I've already gain staged this or gain staged it. I don't call it gain staging, I call it platforming. You know how you have platforms at a train station? Let's say you've got a lot of tracks at your train station and you've got a lot of platforms. I want to make sure that all of my trains are lined up, ready to go. And I want to make sure that they all go out at the same time, right? So here's what I do is when I've got this all set down to pre-fader metering is on. All right, let's grab all of these faders. And what we'll do is we'll pull them all down to the bottom. And so now what I can do is I can play the track and you can see all of these faders peaking. And the other key thing is make sure that they are in peak RMS mode. And make sure your RMS length is decent. I've got this set to 0.6 seconds. And then make sure that the peak hold is on. And I've got the hold length for 2 seconds. The reason being is I want to make sure that I don't miss a thing with where this is all peaking at, right? So let's say I want all of these to be leveled to -6. So I'm looking along these. This guy is okay. Not going to touch that one. This guy is just about okay. This guy could do with adding a little bit more gain because he's a little bit on the quiet side. So let's do that. Now he's perfect. Now this guy is not doing anything at the moment. So let's wait until he comes back in. Oh, actually, this one's okay. I know why I can't do this with this track. So let's just leave that for just a minute. Let's set that one the same. And this one's a little quiet as well. It's a little bit too loud. And this one's good as well. And so I think you guys get the idea. So now what I can do is I can go and kind of balance all of these mixes up. Hang on. So let's get the drums in.
It's really very cool. It is the best thing PreSonus has ever done. It really floats my boat. I really, really love it. Cool doesn't cut it. It really is the best. Check this A flat minor chord. Check this G flat 7. D flat 7. B flat minor. Love this vocoder. It's really very cool. It is the best thing PreSonus has ever done.
There, you get the idea. So essentially all I was doing there was I got everything so that everything was peaking more or less at the same kind of arbitrary level. And then I go from there. I don't think that's the same as gain staging, because it's not necessary. Gain staging is not necessary, but having everything kind of ballparked at an even level means that it's just easier when you start your mix to kind of balance your levels. But that's really all it means. So I hope that was helpful. Bill Shepard said that explanation is great. Many are confused because you can have multiple tracks fed into one instrument and you can have one instrument with multiple outs. Exactly. That is exactly why tracks and channels are not the same. And that's why when you load up impact into a song, you see one track and maybe 5 or 6 channels in the mixer. Because impact has multiple outputs. The reason why it has that is so that you can EQ any of or compress any of the drum pads in impact individually. It's designed to do that. Contact does that. And there are all sorts of other virtual instruments that have multiple outputs that allow you to do that so that you can treat them individually. So this is why tracks and channels are not the same thing. Otherwise, you'd end up with, maybe a dozen impact pads as individual tracks in your mix. And then let's say you've got a whole other sampler that does the same thing. And all of a sudden you've got 5,000 tracks in your song. Now, some people like to work with large track counts. And some people actually need to do that for, orchestral work, for sound design and things like that. People like my good friend Rich Cresswell, he works in a similar way. He has lots and lots and lots and lots of tracks. He has I think one of his templates has nearly 2,000 tracks in it. But he needs that for what he does. And that's not illegitimate. It depends upon what you're working in. But this is why tracks and channels are different. It's an excellent point. Tony says, wow, what you just explained about gain staging is liberating. I can mix my way. Hallelujah, praise you, Jesus. Yes, amen. Preach it, brother. Absolutely. Bill Shepard says, I like the leveling tip. Many people use to normalize the audio, which makes things complicated. I used Mix Tool before the gain tool was added. That was a game-changing add. Yeah, exactly. And I did something similar with Mix Tool as well, actually. And it was just daft, actually. And so I didn't like having Mix Tool as the first plugin because I thought it's just an ugly workflow. So I got rid of that. And then so I started doing what I do now with the gain controls using the event gain in the arranger view. And I did that for the longest time ever. And that meant because so doing it that way means you have to have the inspector open, the track inspector open all the time. And that means when you flip between one channel and the next, you can kind of do this, but only looking at one channel. So it kind of does work, and then you can just use the event gain. But here's the problem. Here's the snag with doing it that way. When you select an event, you have the event data, not just the track data. You have the event data, but the little mix, I can't speak today. The channel strip that's in there is the same channel strip as you have in the mixer. It's just isolated on its own, so you can see just what that channel is doing. Handy, very handy. So it does make it possible for you to do gain staging, platforming, leveling, whatever you want to call it, without using the input controls. It's just a pain in the butt doing it that way. But that's how I did it until the gain controls were added. And I was just like, oh, yes! I did a little dance in my studio. In fact, I might have even danced all the way down the stairs out to the front garden and yelled hallelujah at the top of my lungs and then came back in and somehow avoided arrest. But here we are. And so these gain controls are awesome. They are fantastic. Please use them. Make the best use out of them. Use the pre-fader metering. This was a personal feature request. I requested this. I requested the feature, the pre-fader metering. I did not actually request the input controls. Somebody else requested those, and I just voted it up. So when you make feature requests over at answers.presonus.com, it really does work. It really does work. You know, providing there's a lot of votes. If there's a lot of votes for something, or when the developers look at that and they go, you know what, that's not very popular, but damn it, that's a good idea, it will get added to Studio One, to a future build. And this certainly has had that. So, so there you go, folks. I hope that this has been a useful Sunday Night Live for you. And it is absolutely throwing it down outside. And we have some thunder rolling about out there. But fortunately, it is not close enough for me to think about shutting up shop. So we're good. So I don't know if Mike is here or not for doing an after show party over on Zoom. If he's here, then we should definitely do that. I don't know if he's still here. He might be out and about. So, but either way, we'll call it a night there. Thank you everybody for all of your excellent questions, and especially Christopher, thank you for emailing that question that kind of kicked everything off and made this show really, really cool. If you would like to email me a question, again, just go down to johnnylipshamstudios.co.uk, hit the contact us button and fill out the form there and email me your question, and we'll kick the show off with your question. Email questions are great because you're not limited by characters in a chat. And you don't have the danger of me potentially missing them because I check my emails every single day. So please do that. I would appreciate it, and it would make things easier for you. Might make things easier for me too. But yeah, if you've got a question that is a bit more detailed, then certainly do ask it via email. Otherwise, you can ask it in the chat as well. Even if you're early, just get it straight in there. And until then, folks, we'll be back for Songwriting Simplified on Wednesday. And I'm not quite sure what we're going to do subject-wise, because we've kind of done kind of melody to some degree. So I will have to think about what we're going to do, and we'll get to that on Wednesday. So if songwriting and arranging and composing is your bag, and music theory is your bag, and you carry both bags at the same time, you are a very cool person. Come on back over. Excuse me. Come on back over here on the same time on Wednesday night for Songwriting Simplified, and I will see you all then. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.